Thanks, Prof. Hi, everybody. My name is Mulemo Mwashudi. I'm a co-founder and COO of Hermetics Health, which is a recently licensed medical pharmaceutical cultivation facility based in Broncos Strait.
Okay, so tell us about the journey of licensing it.
It was quite a long journey for us. I mean, we started the company in 2018. And initially, a big part of that time was spent finding an ideal location and the land where the project could be held. Then we went into the SAPRA process, which still at that stage was quite in the early days. I think at the time when we started, there were about less than 20 licenses issued. So getting proper guidelines of what to do and what was expected was quite a challenge. Thereafter, also along the journey, things changed and moved quite quickly, both globally and locally as well. We could see the regulator was beginning to learn a lot more, and it became a lot more stringent on the requirements for the license as we moved along. So it was quite interesting for us and quite challenging. Obviously, there was also then COVID that came into it, which slowed down quite a lot of things dramatically for us. And ultimately, we were happy that the resolution letters finally come out, and yeah, we are now in the fundraising phase to finalize that, and so that we can start operations.
Okay, but you already have a facility, right? So over the past 3 years, getting up to that point of getting the resolution, you put up a facility. Tell us a little bit about that facility.
Yes, as you know, the SAPRA requirements are that you need to have a working site that they can come and inspect when they're doing the inspections before they give you the license. So we had to go through that as well. What we always try to do was to keep it as modular as possible so that we could also be conservative in terms of the amount of investment that went into that. So I think there's quite a lot of pros and cons on the medical side. People need to be very specific about who your customer and your target market will be in the end. Some of the previous presenters have alluded to the fact that this is still mostly an export market, but internationally as well, regulation is changing quite quickly. So we need to keep abreast of all of those. And as I said, for us, it was about minimizing the investment upfront until we knew we had the license, which was a key requirement for investors before having a bankable business case.
Okay. Are you able to share how much you spent?
Yeah, I mean, we can share that. I mean, our facility was probably one of the least expensive ones out there. We spent probably on the ground about close to 7.5 million. The delay has cost us a lot more than that also in the meantime. But yes, I know some of the other facilities have gone for 20, 30 million rands of investment, which makes it very, very hard for your average person to go for these licenses.
Yeah, the ones that we saw in Lesotho were $5 million, 100 million Maruti.
But the beauty of those, Prof, is that those are now when you go into operation, which is a different case. And remember, in Lesotho, you get your license up front.
Yes.
So it's easier to fundraise on those. The challenge is when you're in South Africa and our regulatory environment, where do you get the funds to be able to put up the facility before they can come and inspect it?
Before you get the investment. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. And in terms of market, so what's your market focus?
Right now, for us, it would be Europe and Australia. As I mentioned, things are moving quite quickly in all those markets globally. For example, when we started, looking at Israel was not a difficulty, but since then Israel has come up with their own regulation where they wouldn't look at things like living soil, and also they're quite prescriptive in the kind of accreditation you require to be able to sell into those markets. So all of that is changing quite drastically, and even in the next 2 to 3 years, I'm sure the market's going to evolve even further. There's expectations around the price dropping. There's new facilities coming up in markets like Australia as well. And as we've mentioned earlier, Canada with their the oversupply they're sitting on are also beginning to sell into the same markets we're all focusing on.
Okay, and so what sort of products are you looking to export?
At this stage, it will be the dried flower, and until there are more facilities locally where we can go and extract into oil, then we'll start looking at selling products like the oils and so on, and the distillate and that.
Okay, maybe talk a little bit about social impact. What's been the impact, or what do you anticipate to be the impact of this project?
For us, we always set it up as a project that will be open for community in terms of training and running an incubator, not just for the cannabis side, but for our cultivation ethos, which is regenerative agriculture along the lines of permaculture. So we're also fortunate to have a farm that's big enough that will allow us to have a section there for training people on farming fruits and vegetables in the same methodology. And we will be able to look at seeing how we can sell the excess into the local market on that side. All along with also having the cannabis incubator as well, specifically for that industry. As some of the previous speakers have mentioned, I think there's a lot more opportunities around the testing and the extraction for that to be done in kind of a what you call a co-op setup, which is wider open to not just the bigger but also the smaller farmers out there. So that's the route we would like to see the industry evolving in.
Okay, great. I'll take questions from the audiences. Any questions for Male? You can introduce yourself as you want.
Thanks, Mulema. It's Apoti, also here in Joburg. Quick one from me is how big is your facility?
It's about 3,600 square meters of grow area, which we look into add another greenhouse for 1,400 square meters. But we're sitting on a 100-hectare piece of land.
Oh, okay. Last one is, did you also have to get like the off-takers in Europe and any before you could?
Very much so. And also the new step. Okay, well, the new step as well that SAPRA is going through is they also arrange for a telephonic interview with your off-taker, because there was a lot of middlemen in the industry that were trying to sort of sell off-takes, but cultivators were ending up with product that they couldn't move. So they're becoming a lot more stringent in making sure that whoever you say you're selling to has the required paperwork on the other end to be able to import your product. And how do you meet them? I mean, it's as simple as joining these kind of calls and networking in the industry, using LinkedIn and so on as well. There's a lot of them. I mean, even at the recent expo in Cape Town, there was quite a few of international players locally networking and looking for product.
Yeah, my question is, what do you do with your stocks? The stocks after you take the flower and the result.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What do you do with the residue?
With the residue, so well, SAPRA requires you to definitely destroy that. Or if you can't reuse it in your process, you have to make a case to them about it.
Oh, okay. So you can't use it as byproduct for other
You can, but you need to make sure that you can prove there's traceability.
It's better to prove.
It's not easy.
Okay, there's a question.
This is Yogesh. Happy birthday once again.
Thanks, Yogesh.
Just you being the first one of the first growers in the country, licensed facility. Just for the audience, what were the biggest challenges in licensing throughout?
What were the biggest
Challenges.
I would say in the process, capital raising is definitely one. The other, as I mentioned, is around regulation that was constantly changing, and where there isn't always a set of guidelines that says this is how to do this and this is how to set this up and so on. So a lot of the things are still being trial and error, both on the regulator side and on our side.
Okay, and then there's a question about intercropping. Are you going to be intercropping your crop with other things? Maybe, yeah.
Not on the cannabis portion side of it. But I mean, in Living Soil, we do use companion planting as well.
Okay, we have two questions, two hands up. Dr. Charles?
Thank you so much, Malemo. I wanted to check on the requirements, standards for export. What standards do you have to comply with for international exports? I know, for example, on the crop, on the primary production at the farm, you might want standards like global gap. I'm not too sure whether that is a requirement. And then on the processing side, obviously you need your good manufacturing practices, but you might also need other standards. I don't know whether they apply to hemp, like your HACCP, because I guess hemp is considered as a food, isn't it? Or cannabis is considered as a food, especially the medicinal one, pharmaceutical one, that is given orally. So what sort of standards do you require for export?
Thanks for the question, Doctor. I can only talk to the medicinal cannabis side. So as you correctly mentioned, you are expected to grow under GAP GACP, which SAPRA's license, I believe, is regarded as being equivalent to that within the PIC side of things. For the drying and the extraction and packaging, you are expected to be GMP compliant if you're going to export internationally, for example, into Europe. But even that, there's differences in GMP. Europe has their own specifications, which are a lot more stringent and harder to get, the EU GMP. Canada uses some slightly different standard. And Australia, luckily for now, was still quite closely linked to the SAPRA standard, although I believe they've also now moved into a GMP requirement as of 6 weeks ago. Israel, by the way, has its own completely separate one, which would be your control union medical cannabis standard equivalent. So it varies, and it depends which market you're targeting.
Yeah, but I mean,
sorry, Prof, if I can just maybe follow up there. So do you have those service providers here in South Africa that are able to offer both the training and the certification to those standards? And yeah, you said also that countries vary, but sometimes we look at international standard. There could just be one international standard. For example, on the agricultural side, there is one that is called global gap. Once you comply with that, then it satisfies everyone around the world. Not too sure about the processing. In the food industry, I know we have what you call FSSC 22000 or ISO 22000. That is international, and once you get certified to that one, you can go everywhere in the world.
In a perfect world, Doctor, would agree with you, but remember the cannabis industry is still an emerging industry globally. Jeff would have probably been able to speak better to all of those different standards, but certainly countries do that independently. Even the definition of how much THC you have in hemp, for example, is different from country to country. So I think probably the next 10 years or so, those kind of standards will be more readily available globally, but we're not yet there in cannabis.
Yeah, and it's a non-tariff barrier actually. So they're trying to moderate the amount of product that's coming in by not using tariffs, because then that's WTO has to come into it. But they're using non-tariff barriers. Yeah, I know it happens even in the peanut industry. Okay, so last question, and then we'll let you go. Where do you see your your company in 5 years' time?
Oh, that's hard to tell, Doc. I think definitely, as has been alluded before, we need to look at our local regulations. None of us who are licensed cultivators can sustain businesses on export markets purely. And also purely because we don't have any control over the changes in those markets. So we need to get to a point where our regulators can open the local market, both medicinally and recreationally. Recreationally is the bigger part of the cannabis market usually, and that's also where we can have all those inclusivity requirements more stringently apply in the companies. So we will be in 5 years from now. Well, I wouldn't want to guess in this rapidly changing industry, but hopefully it'll be there and be one of the leaders out there.
Yeah, that's great. But the regulations have to be friendly, because the window will close very, very quickly. As I think that's what we're hearing. It's a little sad that our regulators didn't come. We'll try to invite them or share with them the recording. But I think it will be important that regulators actually come to these conversations and listen to what the industry is saying, especially because now we have Operation Bulinke. And that way is not going to open up if the regulatory space and policies are not friendly. One last comment question.
Thanks, Bob. Hi, William. This is Lisa speaking. It has been mentioned before that it's quite important that your team is composed in the right manner, because you are starting a pharmaceutical business, right? I wanted to just check with you, what's the composition of your team, and what were the sort of even mission critical roles that people hold there, which were able to take you over the line?
So can you repeat the second portion? I understood the first is about the composition.
Yeah.
Then what about the mission critical?
And then the roles within your team, which were quite important in taking you over the line in terms of your whole licensing process.
Okay. Well, on the medicinal side, one of the important roles is definitely your regulatory pharmacist that sits on the team. They're actually also the person that SAPRA primarily kind of holds accountable for the site and for the handling of the product. Over and above that, I would say obviously your cultivation team is key. A lot of people think because they've had their own small vegetable gardens, it means they can grow cannabis. Growing cannabis is quite different, and it can be almost part science, part art. A lot of the facilities that have gone up haven't managed to commercialize their crop on the first, second, or third time. It's not that easy. So your cultivation team is definitely key to that. Further than that, I would say your management team and the finance team that supports it too, because again, this is a capital intensive greenfields operation. So you need to really be able to plan for that quite strictly, and remembering that we are working in an environment that's rapidly changing all around us. So that, and yes, your leadership team, I think, is definitely key, because again, it's a startup. We've been running 3 years, but we're still a startup pre-revenue. So it's key that you have the right kind of support structure for making the decisions that you need to do.
All right. Thanks a lot, Molemo, and best wishes. I was very impressed when I came to your operations. So
thank you,
I wish you well. I hope that you'll not be like Twitter, very popular, but still no money coming in.
All hopes that we won't be, definitely.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Bye. Our next speaker is David Rock from Embarked.